Mike Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and a while back I did a video talking about oddly specific parallels between The Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. I'll link to that video below in case you're interested. But one of the things that I talked about, of course, is the Dark Lord enemy in both stories, Sauron and Voldemort. And one of the other interesting things about them that's parallel is that they're kind of nameless in the sense that Voldemort is he who must not be named, and Sauron, according to Faramir, is not named by the men of Gondor either. So I was listening to Corey Olsen, that's the Tolkien professor, discuss this. I believe it was in his Lord of the Rings seminar series from way back, and he kind of talks about this, and he mentions the fact that you get the idea that in the Lord of the Rings, that's more of it's not out of fear like it is for Voldemort. It's more of we're just not even going to give you the dignity of having a name. And so the more I thought about that, the more I realized there was some depth to that topic. So I wanted to discuss it here. And so I'm going to talk about ways in which the non-naming of Sauron is significant. So let's talk about that. One of the things that you notice if you read a lot of Tolkien, and particularly if you add in the appendices to the Lord of the Rings and you read the Silmarillion, names are important. A lot of the time, names actually have specific meaning. For example, when in the Silmarillion, Turin's sister is born, they name her Nienor, which basically is a reference to tears because the family's really sad. It's in the wake of the battle in which way too many good people died. And Turin's father, was captured. So you get names that are specifically, have specific significance. They're not just names. And that's typical of most cultures, even in this world, because most cultures, the name means something, even if in English we no longer know what that is. So, for example, I'm trying to think of a good common one. I'm trying to think of a really common name that I actually know the meaning of. There's tons of them. I mean, I guess just for one quick example, Isaac, for instance, means laughter in Hebrew. That's a name for, it means laughter, but we just think of it as a name in English because we're divorced from its original language root. So that's a common theme in the world, but it seems foreign to most English speakers when we get it in Tolkien, but he's working from a long tradition. So you get a lot of names, and also in the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, you get names being heaped on people. You get, and again, going back to Turin as the example, Turin takes a bunch of names to himself, which are significant for various reasons. Some of them he gives himself, some of them are acquired because other people give them to him. For example, he kind of goes incognito for a while, doesn't want to give out his real name, but he's wielding this black sword, and so for lack of anything better to call him, a lot of people start calling him the Mormagil, which in Elvish means the black sword. They're basically calling him by the weapon that he wields. Later on in the story, he also takes to himself the surname, sort of Turambar, which means master of fate. And the idea there is he's thinking or planning on basically becoming the master of his own fate and not letting fate master him, which becomes ironic in a lot of ways, but I won't get into that. So you get names that are given or taken by people that are also very significant. And we see this in The Lord of the Rings as well. I mean, you get, for instance, early on, Frodo is given the name of Elf-Friend, which is not a name, obviously, but it functions in very much the same way. You also get Aragorn, who, if you pay attention, has somewhere in excess of 10 names, if I remember correctly, once you count up all the various nicknames. Éomer names him Wingfoot. He's called Strider by the men of Bree. He's, Elessar the Elfstone. He's Aragorn, son of Arathorn. He is Invinyatar, the Renewer. He is Telkontar, which is basically just Elvish for Strider. He says that he will use that as the name of his house. He's got all these names, and they all have some kind of significance. So names are a very significant part of Tolkien's universe. There's a lot of different aspects to the way that names function. That being the case, what you call a person is very significant, and that plays into how we see the fact that Gondor, the men of Gondor, don't want to, name Sauron specifically. Now let's take a look at some precedents for that and why that ends up being important for Sauron. So of course, we do have the aspect that I mentioned earlier, that the Tolkien professor mentioned, that basically the lack of giving Sauron a name is a way of kind of undignifying him. And it's interesting because there's a reference earlier in the story when Frodo runs into Tom Bombadil, and if I have to say this every time I do a Tom Bombadil reference, if you don't know who Tom Bombadil is, I will link to some videos in the description below that tell who Tom Bombadil is. I cover the parts of the book that aren't included in the movies. But at one point, Frodo asks Bombadil, "Who are you?" And Bombadil says, "Don't you know yet?" I'm Tom Bombadil, I'm the master, that's the only answer. The way he says it specifically is, "Don't you know my name yet?" That's the only answer. And then he says, "Who are you, alone and nameless?" Basically leaving the hanging question, if you didn't have the name of Frodo Baggins, how would you answer, "Who are you?" And if you think about it, it's actually a very difficult question to answer. If we don't have names to give people, they're almost nobodies. It's like they aren't a person. So by not naming Sauron, it's almost like they're saying, you're not even a person. Now, you do get the idea in Lord of the Rings that part of that may also be a little bit out of the fear aspect, and I'll get back to that a little bit more, but certainly it does seem like when Faramir says it, he says, "We don't name him." He doesn't say it like in Harry Potter, "He who must not be named." And you get a very clear picture in Harry Potter that the thing about naming him is purely about the fear of Voldemort. But we do have a precedent not only in Tom Bombadil's response to Frodo, but also in the Silmarillion for this sort of thing. In the Silmarillion, of course, Sauron's boss, Melkor, is the main villain. And one of the interesting things about that is whenever he really starts to do the worst of what he ends up doing and sets off the chain of events, he is given a new name by the elves who oppose him, and that name is Morgoth. And Morgoth really just means the black foe. I mean, that's really all it is. And so way back then, the Dark Lord of the Silmarillion was basically stripped of his name, which was a great and glorious name because he was the greatest of the Valar, and he was given instead this kind of descriptor. You're just a dark enemy. That's all you are. You're a non-person. You're just a bad guy. So you already have a precedent for that all the way back at the beginning of the Silmarillion, and you can see then how in Gondor they're kind of just taking that a step further and saying, well, we're just not even going to give him a descriptor. We're going to not even name him even in a descriptive sense. So that's one way in which we can kind of see this whole not naming somebody as an insult, sort of. And another interesting aspect to this is the fact that when Sauron first comes to the elves and teaches them the craft of ring making and tries to pretend that he's kind of, a good guy, and they don't really know who he is at this point, he gives to himself a name, which, if I remember correctly, is Anatar, but basically it means just giver of gifts. And the idea there is he is giving himself a name which seems, very positive and hides his true identity at the same time. And so this also kind of plays into the entire dynamic because now that everybody knows who he is, it's like, we're not, you fooled us once by giving yourself a false name that totally misidentified the kind of person you are, now we're not only gonna correctly identify you, we're just gonna non-identify you. We're going to completely ignore the fact that you have a personal identity. You have lost any right to that. Now, going back to the idea of the fear aspect, which I think you do kind of get, and the reason I think that that's part of it is because Faramir, even in reference to the land of Mordor at one point, basically says, he doesn't name it, he just says yonder and points to where Mordor is. And you get the impression that some of that is not like an abject, terror like in Harry Potter most people have of Voldemort, but at least the kind of, it's something to be feared, but it is also something to have courage against and to be withstood. And you can kind of see that fitting in as well, because one of the aspects that comes through a lot in Tolkien's writings in Middle-earth is the whole idea of the Northern European idea of courage, which is something he talks about in his letters and other things too. He mentions different aspects of how, Northern European lore and legend has all these great ideals. He thinks Beowulf is a good example of that. But the idea of Northern courage is kind of the idea of the end is coming. We're all doomed, but we're going to stand against it anyway. Now, of course, for Tolkien, and from a Christian point of view, that's wrong in the sense that, for Tolkien being a Christian, he's looking at it and saying the very end actually is a happy end, but, in our mortal lifetimes, it may be really a bad end. So, he takes that and kind of incorporates that Northern courage into a slightly more Christianized story, but the same idea kind of applies. Faramir is looking at Mordor and Sauron as a force which is apparently unstoppable and apparently overwhelming. They will lose. And of course, Gandalf shares the same view in the sense that he tells the captains before they set off for the Black Gate, we cannot win this war by arms. We can't do it. The only hope is the destruction of the ring. And that's a slim hope. So Gandalf recognizes as well, at the end of the day, there's no way we can defeat Sauron by force. It's not going to happen. If it comes down to that, it really is totally just a hopeless endeavor. And so you see a little bit of that in Faramir's, reference to Mordor as just that over there. He's not willing to name it because it's something that's just overwhelming and powerful. But you even get the idea. They refer to it as the Dark Land and things like that. They almost never really call it Mordor. But that same idea kind of applies to Sauron. The idea of not giving him a name, it's acknowledging in some sense their fear of Sauron as somebody who, rightly should be feared because he's powerful, and barring an extreme act of providence, which is basically what happens at the end of the Lord of the Rings, he will win the ultimate victory, and then the world will be covered in darkness. But at the same time, Faramir is basically saying, yeah, things look hopeless. I'm not even going to name those things over there because they're scary, but I'm also not naming them because I'm standing up to the scariness and saying, even though you're terrifying, you are not going to force me into, referring to you with the dignity of a name, and especially not the dignity of a name that you give yourself and make yourself sound like you're some awesome hotshot. When he was calling himself Anatar, the giver of gifts. And kind of the same idea too, like whenever they have the meeting outside the Black Gate, the mouth of Sauron refers to him as Sauron the Great, and Sauron always kind of tries to accumulate these titles to himself, like he's the Lord of Middle-earth and all this stuff. And so, again, that kind of plays into this idea that the men of Gondor are looking at that going, okay, your victory might be inevitable, but at the end of the day, we're still not going to just lie down and take it. We're going to resist to the end, even if it results in our destruction, and we're just not going to dignify you with a name, and certainly not a title that you want to take to yourself, which you would not have any just right to. So those were the thoughts that were kind of going through my head. There may be more aspects to this that I haven't really thought of or explored yet, but certainly that sparked a thought process, and I think it was a kind of interesting one. So I hope you found that discussion somewhat interesting. If you have any other thoughts on the topic, please do leave them in the comments below. There's, like I said, probably other aspects to this that I haven't even thought of, because there's really just a lot of material out there in terms of names and their significance. But anyway, if you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up and share it around. If you want to learn more about Tolkien and the worlds he created, or just Tolkien in general, please do subscribe to the channel, which you can do here. And you can check out a couple of my previous videos up here. I've also got links to the videos that I mentioned and my Patreon page in the description below. So until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.